In the gilded halls of power, stupidity wears a crown. Behind closed doors, England's royals weren't just majestic. They were messy, petty, impulsive, and occasionally spectacularly unqualified for the job. From lost crown jewels to phantom pregnancies, golden dinner plates to royal makeout sessions, these were the moments that made their own courtiers cringe. This isn't the history they put in textbooks. It's the parade of royal faceplants you were never meant to see. Welcome to 33 Dumbest Things English Royals Did Behind Closed Doors, where monarchy meets magnificent miscalculation. Before we open the palace doors and let the disasters tumble out, take a second to subscribe, because royal messes like these deserve a front row seat. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it on your end? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We want to know which corner of the world you're losing sleep in to hear about kings losing their minds. 1. King John losing his crown. Jewels in a swamp, 1216. There are royal embarrassments, and then there's accidentally driving the crown jewels into a swamp and never seeing them again. It takes a special kind of genius to lose the literal symbols of your monarchy in title sludge. But King John had a knack for being historically disliked and profoundly unlucky. By 1216, John had managed to alienate his barons, infuriate the Pope, bankrupt his treasury, and somehow ignite a civil war against his own throne. Not bad for a guy who started out as the backup royal sibling. With rebel forces closing in and foreign mercenaries invading, John decided to flee the East Coast and regroup. He chose a shortcut across the Wash, a flat expanse of marshland and tidal estuary between Norfolk and Lincolnshire. His plan? Simple. Cross during low tide, beat the rebels to Newark Castle, and avoid any fighting. His baggage train, overloaded with gold, relics, jewels, silver plate, and royal heirlooms, followed behind, creaking along in carts dragged by exhausted horses. But John forgot to check something: tide tables. As his entourage passed safely over the wet sands, the tide suddenly turned. And the North Sea doesn't wait for kings. The ocean swallowed the rear of his procession in one slow, cold gulp. Horses sank, carts toppled, treasure vanished. Monks described it with a kind of holy glee, like the sea itself had passed judgment. The jewels were never recovered. Somewhere under the silt and salt, John's entire legacy, crown, plate, private letters, ceremonial robes, dissolved into watery oblivion, and fittingly, so did he. Days later, bloated and feverish, John died. Reportedly from dysentery, possibly from peaches and cider, and probably from karma. Chroniclers barely bothered to eulogize him. Even his allies admitted he'd been a very bad man. Dante later placed him in the 6th circle of hell. Today, he's mostly remembered for signing the Magna Carta under pressure, and for literally sinking the monarchy's bling. And while England's swamp-eaten treasure has never been found, the sheer absurdity of a king misplacing an empire's worth of gold in a mudflat remains one of history's most poetic punchlines. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a metaphor in slow motion. Still, if John was a cautionary tale about royal logistics, his descendant Henry VIII turned royal decision-making into performance art. And nothing captures that better than the time he trusted a portrait over reality, and ended up married to someone he couldn't stand the sight of. 2. Henry VIII marrying Anne of Cleves. After only seeing a portrait. In the grand tradition of powerful men making decisions with zero emotional foresight and way too much ego, we present Henry VIII meeting his 4th wife and immediately wanting a divorce. All because her face didn't match her portrait. By 1539, Henry was down 3 wives, 1 dead, 1 divorced, 1 beheaded, and looking for number 4. His advisors, eager to secure an alliance with the Protestant German states, suggested Anne of Cleves. She was royal, German, politically convenient, and unseen. Henry hadn't met her. But hey, He'd seen a painting. That portrait, painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, showed a serene, fair-skinned woman with delicate features and regal posture. Henry liked what he saw. The marriage contract was signed. Anne sailed to England. And then the real trouble began. When Henry finally met her in person, he was horrified. Not just disappointed, visibly appalled. He reportedly called her a Flanders mare, which, while unfair, was peak Tudor pettiness. He said she smelled. He said her skin was rough. He claimed she wasn't a virgin. He sulked and refused to consummate the marriage, telling his doctors he could not do it. Which is an odd flex. Anne, meanwhile, had done nothing wrong. She was dignified, polite, and baffled. She'd come to England expecting a royal marriage. Instead, she got ghosted by the most powerful man in Christendom and then traded in like a political poker chip. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled. To save face, Henry blamed Holbein, the painter, for deceiving him. And while Anne graciously accepted the annulment and became the king's beloved sister, Henry immediately married Catherine Howard, who was 30 years younger and eventually beheaded for adultery. So really, no one won. But here's the kicker. Holbein's painting of Anne was accurate. Other eyewitnesses described her as perfectly pleasant, maybe even pretty. So the only real mystery here is what exactly Henry expected. A Photoshop filter? A 16th century glamour shot? Or maybe the truth is simpler. Henry wanted to fall in love with an ideal. A canvas woman who wouldn't talk back, age, or challenge him. When reality showed up wearing a corset and speaking German, he panicked. But Anne had the last laugh. She outlived Henry by a decade, avoided execution, and kept her fortune. All because one man let his libido run royal policy through a painting. Which brings us to another king with very different priorities, Edward II. A monarch so uninterested in ruling, he'd rather hang out with roofers and thatch cottages than deal with the affairs of state. And that's only the second royal train wreck. 31 more to go. If you're already hooked on the chaos, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And while we're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you doom scrolling through royal disasters at 2 a.m.? We see you. 3. Edward II preferring carpentry and thatching to governing. Imagine your country is falling apart. Civil unrest is brewing, your nobles are squabbling, your advisors are growing restless, and your king is out back building a chair. Edward II, son of the fearsome Edward I, a monarch known as the Hammer of the Scots, had big shoes to fill. He also had zero interest in filling them. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1307, Edward made it abundantly clear. He was not his father. He wasn't even particularly interested in being king. He had other hobbies, thatching roofs, for example, mending carts, constructing little wooden benches with the enthusiasm of a village craftsman and the blind eye of a man forgetting his coronation had already happened. His love for manual labor wasn't the problem. It was the optics. Medieval England didn't particularly enjoy watching their monarch play peasant. Nobles grumbled as he wandered off during court meetings to hammer boards and chat with tradesmen. Chroniclers, never ones to waste a metaphor, described him as a man who ruled with a mallet and chisel instead of a crown and scepter. But the thatching wasn't even the worst of it. Edward also had a habit of surrounding himself with favorites who were, to put it delicately, not qualified. Chief among them was Piers Gaveston, a charismatic Gascon knight who Edward loved, perhaps platonically, perhaps not, and elevated far beyond his station. Nobles were incensed. Imagine watching your king ignore the treasury crisis because he was too busy organizing a jousting tournament for his best friend. And while Edward was busy building literal furniture, the country was sliding toward chaos. Military campaigns failed. Political alliances soured. Scotland, the very nation his father had spent decades subduing, began reclaiming territory. Meanwhile, England's response? Minimal. The king was distracted. His priorities were somewhere between a birdhouse and a hayloft. Eventually, things fell apart. Gaveston was executed by angry barons. Rebellions broke out. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, turned against him and led an invasion. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and ultimately removed from the chessboard altogether. The irony is that Edward probably would have made a fine artisan. He may have been happier in a quiet workshop, sanding planks and drinking with Thatchers. But fate made him a king, and England paid the price for a monarch more interested in roofs than rulership. If Edward taught us that a king who wants to be a carpenter will lose his crown, then his spiritual ancestor, King Ethelred the Unready, offered a different lesson. Sometimes the throne isn't lost by action, but by stunning inaction, delivered with the enthusiasm of a damp crumpet. 4. King Ethelred. The Unready's Bad Advice. Obsession. Most kings suffer from too much confidence. Ethelred suffered from chronic hesitation and the royal equivalent of asking the wrong friend for life advice, again and again, for nearly 40 years. His nickname, Unready, didn't mean lazy or unprepared. It came from the Old English word unraid, meaning bad counsel, as in, this man consistently listened to the worst people in the room, and he ruled like it. Not that it stopped him from staying in power. Ethelred reigned from 978 to 1013, was briefly kicked out, then ruled again from 1014 until 1016. You could say he never really left. Much like his terrible decision-making, during his reign, England was under near constant attack from Viking raiders. Towns were torched, abbeys looted, and people taken as slaves. Ethelred's response? Bribery. He repeatedly paid massive sums of gold, known as Danegeld, to buy temporary peace. On paper, it worked. The Vikings took the money and left, for a few months. Then they came back, with more ships. This happened multiple times. At one point, he paid an amount so huge that it destabilized the economy and raised taxes across England. Essentially, the nation funded its own humiliation. It's the medieval equivalent of trying to get rid of hackers by Venmoing them. Ethelred's court was riddled with self-serving nobles, and instead of trimming the fat, he just kept asking them what to do. Their answer, inevitably, pay the Vikings again. Or worse, insult them. In one particularly catastrophic move, Ethelred ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day in 1002. The idea? Send a message. The result? He accidentally murdered a Danish princess, sister to King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Sweyn responded like any reasonable Viking monarch would, by launching a full-scale invasion. Within a decade, he captured London and forced Ethelred to flee to Normandy like a medieval intern who'd accidentally unplugged the kingdom. To Ethelred's credit, he did return after Sweyn's death, but with no better ideas. His second reign was just as muddled, just as indecisive, and just as drenched in bad advice. When he finally died in 1016, he left behind a country exhausted, overtaxed, and functionally leaderless. If Edward II built chairs while England burned, Ethelred paid the arsonist and asked if they wanted a cup of tea. And as Viking axes gleamed off the coast, he simply closed his eyes and prayed for a different outcome. But if Ethelred was too passive, then Henry VI swung too far the other way. Not into rage or violence, but into holy detachment. A king so pious, so saint-like, so emotionally fragile, he basically tried to monk his way through a civil war. 5. Henry VI. Trying to be a monk. Instead of a king, Henry VI had the soul of a mystic trapped inside a monarchy built on power, paranoia, and the occasional beheading. If history had allowed kings to opt out, retreat to a cloister, and spend their reigns in silent prayer surrounded by candle smoke and Gregorian chants, Henry VI might have gone down as a beloved saint. Instead, he ended up presiding over one of the bloodiest civil wars in English history, while quietly weeping in the corner. Crowned at just 9 months old after his father, Henry V, died of dysentery in France, baby Henry inherited a kingdom at the peak of its imperial swagger. England controlled large swaths of France and had a war machine to match. The problem? Henry VI didn't inherit his father's iron will. He inherited something closer to porcelain. As he grew, it became painfully clear to everyone at court that Henry had no interest in war, politics, or even public appearances. He preferred prayer over power, scripture over speeches, and quiet contemplation over commanding armies. While nobles schemed and France plotted revenge, Henry was often holed up in chapels, fasting and lamenting the sins of mankind, while his kingdom began to collapse under the weight of unresolved tensions. Things escalated quickly. England's hold on France crumbled, taxes soared, and public frustration began to bubble over. But Henry's response was not rallying troops or holding council. Instead, he withdrew. Not metaphorically. He literally became catatonic for over a year, refusing to speak, eat, or even acknowledge the birth of his own son. Political leadership was so absent, it had to be borrowed from Richard, Duke of York, setting off the inevitable bloodbath that was the Wars of the Roses. But even after partially recovering, Henry didn't exactly bounce back. He wandered the halls of Windsor, reciting psalms, engaging in acts of public piety, and gazing lovingly at stained glass windows. When civil war officially erupted between the houses of Lancaster and York, Henry's role was less king and more confused bystander. He was occasionally dragged onto the battlefield, where he'd pray quietly, while others fought and died for his crown. His wife, the formidable Margaret of Anjou, effectively ran the country in his place, leading armies and cutting political deals, while Henry, ever the gentle soul, handed out alms and worried about salvation. Eventually, he was captured, imprisoned, restored, and imprisoned again. Through it all, he barely protested. When he died in the Tower of London, under still murky circumstances, there was no grand final speech, just the legacy of a king who tried to rule with holy water in a world demanding iron and fire. But if Henry VI's piety became his undoing, King Canute offers something very different. A ruler who tried to flex his power, not over nobles or rebels, but over the sea itself. And to this day, no one can agree whether it was a masterstroke of humility or just a royal PR stunt gone hilariously wet. 6. King Canute's Sea Command Stunt. It's one of those stories that sounds too poetic to be true. A king stands proudly on the beach, his throne planted in the wet sand, as he raises a royal hand and commands the incoming tide to halt. The waves ignore him, of course, and slowly creep forward, soaking his feet, his robes, and possibly his dignity. The image has lasted 1,000 years, and like most enduring royal tales, it's been told too many times to still make sense. King Canute, or Canute, depending on how Scandinavian you're feeling, ruled over a vast North Sea empire in the early 11th century. England, Denmark, Norway, and bits of Sweden. He was no fool. A brutal conqueror when needed, an able administrator when peace was preferable. But at some point, a peculiar event unfolded, or was staged, or was misremembered with convenient symbolism. According to early chronicles, Canute's courtiers were flattering him one day, insisting that even nature itself bowed to his will. Tired of the sycophancy, Canute decided to teach them a lesson. He ordered his throne to be carried to the seashore and sat before the tide, raising his voice and commanding the waves not to wet his feet. When they did anyway, because physics, he reportedly declared that no king, however powerful, could rival God. Then he walked away, soaked but triumphant in humility. Or, that's one version. Others believe it was pure theater, a way for Canute to flex how secure he was in his power. Look how I mock the sea. Some interpret it as a failed stunt, meant to impress onlookers and backfiring hilariously when the tide rolled in as scheduled. A few even suggest it never happened at all. Just a medieval myth, told by monks who wanted to make Canute look holier, or at least more self-aware, than he really was. The real mystery isn't whether it happened, it's why we still care. Maybe it's because the mental image is irresistible. A king trying to command the ocean, drenched in royal robes, learning that nature doesn't care about titles. In the end, Canute reportedly never wore his crown again after the incident, placing it instead on a crucifix to remind everyone that divine power doesn't come with a scepter. But whatever his intentions, Canute's tide-commanding moment remains the ultimate symbol of royal overreach, both comical and quietly philosophical. And speaking of royal self-sabotage, few monarchs manage to sabotage state business more enthusiastically, or more inebriatedly, than Edward IV, who turned governing into an excuse for tavern-style debauchery at the royal council table. 7. Edward IV. Getting drunk at his own council meetings. Being a king is hard. There are wars to fund, laws to draft, nobles to placate, and the occasional rebellion to squash. Most monarchs at least pretend to be serious about it. Then there was Edward IV, who preferred his political strategy shaken, not stirred. Edward IV didn't just rule England during the Wars of the Roses. He swaggered through it. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, he looked every inch the ideal monarch. Unfortunately, he governed more like a bored frat king handed a throne by mistake. His reign was peppered with moments of brilliance, decisive battles, sharp alliances, but also with the baffling inability to resist wine, women, or impromptu feasts. And while Edward's appetites were legendary, nowhere were they more publicly embarrassing than in his approach to governing. Council meetings under Edward were less House of Lords and more house party with paperwork. On multiple occasions, he turned serious government sessions into boozy banquets. Picture it. England's most powerful men gathered to debate taxation or foreign diplomacy, only to find the king slurring through agenda items and calling for more claret. Eyewitnesses described him guffawing mid-session, losing track of key policy discussions, and nodding off with wine-stained robes. Occasionally he would hold meetings in bed, literally, surrounded by food, drink, and lounging courtiers. One diplomat from Burgundy left a note simply saying that Edward preferred his council drunk and his nights busier still. Diplomatic speak for, "This man is running the kingdom like a tavern." But Edward's indulgences didn't just harm his image. They destabilized the entire government. He showed open contempt for administrative drudgery, letting key decisions be delayed or mismanaged. Taxes were uneven. Land disputes festered. Nobles jockeyed for influence not through skill, but through access to the king's wine table. Worst of all, his failure to take governance seriously sowed seeds for his own downfall. When he briefly lost the crown to the Earl of Warwick, his own cousin, it wasn't just over politics. It was about trust. Edward had made himself look like a man who couldn't be bothered to rule unless there were refreshments. Of course, he eventually won the throne back, but the damage was done. His second reign was marked by deeper cynicism and a kingdom increasingly aware that the man at the helm could be brilliant when sober, but dangerously detached when not. Still, Edward's boozy leadership was almost charming compared to what came next. If Edward ruled with a wine goblet in hand, his successor, Stephen of Blois, ruled like a man caught in a revolving door, capturing enemies, releasing them, recapturing them, and forgetting what he was doing halfway through. A king so indecisive, even his victories looked like accidents. 8. King Stephen's endless flip-flopping. During his civil war, when the throne of England became vacant in 1135, there were a few contenders. But somehow, Stephen of Blois managed to make himself king. Not by right, but by racing to London before anyone else and charming the church into backing him. It worked. for about 10 minutes. What followed was nearly 2 decades of chaos, known blandly by historians as the anarchy, and more memorably by anyone who lived through it as a time when nothing made sense and everything was on fire. At the center of this royal confusion stood Stephen, a man so indecisive, so bafflingly inconsistent, that his reign resembled a prolonged shrug. His greatest rival was Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry the Fair and rightful heir to the throne. She had royal blood, strong claims, and zero tolerance for nonsense. Stephen had, well, a knack for making things worse. First, he captured Matilda's key supporters. Then he let them go. Then he captured Matilda herself. Then let her go. Then she almost captured him. Then he escaped. Then they did it all again. At one point, Stephen imprisoned Matilda's half-brother and closest general. Then, inexplicably, released him as a gesture of goodwill, mid-war. His barons were bewildered. His enemies were emboldened. And the common folk, caught in the crossfire of all this royal confusion, started calling it the time when Christ and his saints slept. Even Stephen's victories were temporary. He'd win a town, then fail to secure it. He'd seize a castle, then abandon it. His advisors would recommend a course of action. He'd agree, then reverse it by nightfall. One chronicler famously wrote, "He could not remember yesterday." And that's as polite as it gets. The absurdity reached its peak in 1141. After being captured in battle by Matilda's forces and imprisoned in Bristol, Stephen became a king in chains, which at the time was considered a fairly conclusive defeat. But Matilda's pride and Stephen's weird luck collided. She alienated London, Stephen's allies rallied, and within months, he was king again, released and reinstated like a monarch on a return policy. By the time peace was eventually brokered, everyone was exhausted. Stephen would remain king but name Matilda's son, Henry, later Henry II, as his successor. An elegant solution, 2 decades too late. Stephen's reign stands as a case study in royal mismanagement, not because he was cruel or tyrannical, but because he simply couldn't make up his mind. Every decision felt reversible. Every victory was an illusion. Every failure, well, those stuck. And if Stephen's reign was a royal soap opera of missed chances, then Richard II took things in a different direction, creating a monarchy of velvet robes, gold-threaded shoes, and fashion decrees. Because when your country's on edge, what better distraction than inventing haute couture laws to remind everyone you're still in charge? 9. Richard II's obsession with fashion. For some kings, authority is built through war. For others, it's forged through diplomacy, lineage, or sheer political cunning. But Richard II? Richard tried to rule through fabric, glittering brocades, embroidered silks, shoes so long they had to be chained to his knees just to keep him from tripping over his own sense of grandeur. Crowned at the tender age of 10 in 1377, Richard II was raised to believe in divine kingship, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and thus above earthly criticism. And nothing said divine authority quite like head-to-toe gold. His reign became a parade of elegance, etiquette, and expensive wardrobe changes. One chronicler noted that Richard changed outfits 5 times a day, because apparently true governance is a matter of accessorizing. But it wasn't just self-indulgence. Richard's obsession with appearance became policy. He passed actual laws banning commoners from wearing certain fabrics, colors, and cuts. The logic? If everyone looked regal, how would you know who to bow to? Parliament, watching their king enforce a medieval dress code while the treasury bled out and political unrest brewed, began to suspect that England had been handed over to a peacock. Richard also introduced the idea of divine kingship in a highly theatrical fashion, emphasizing ceremony, elevating the royal image, and commissioning elaborate art that made him appear Christ-like. The goal was clear. Don't just rule England. Look like you were carved out of heaven to do it. But as the wardrobe expanded, so did Richard's paranoia. He began punishing anyone who criticized his rule, executing rivals, exiling nobles, and surrounding himself with yes-men who praised his taste in velvet. The more unstable his rule became, the more he doubled down on symbolism and pageantry. He believed that if he looked like a king, he could become one in the eyes of a skeptical, increasingly angry nobility. Unfortunately, crowns and cloaks don't stop rebellions. And in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, returned from exile, gained support from disillusioned lords, and forced Richard to abdicate. The man who spent years perfecting the royal image was quietly taken prisoner, and, not long after, mysteriously died in captivity. In the end, Richard's reign was less about rule and more about representation. He treated monarchy as theater, the throne as a stage. But the audience eventually walked out. Still, while Richard was focused on fabric, his predecessor had a more zoological distraction. Henry III didn't just waste money on building projects and religious relics. He spent a fortune on a royal zoo. Because nothing says stable monarchy like housing elephants in a medieval castle while the kingdom teetered on financial ruin. 10. Henry III's obsession with buying animal curiosities. You'd be forgiven for assuming England's 13th century monarchs were preoccupied with war, taxes, or maintaining control over barons perpetually on the verge of rebellion. But Henry III? Henry just wanted a better menagerie. He ruled for over 50 years, and for much of that time, his interest leaned heavily toward exotic animals. Polar bears, African lions, a leashed leopard or two, all of them imported at absurd expense and housed at the Tower of London. Rebranded in Henry's mind not just as a fortress, but as the first English royal zoo. It began innocently enough. A diplomatic gift here, an unusual beast there. In 1235, Henry received 3 leopards as a wedding present from the Holy Roman Emperor. Most kings might have smiled politely and passed them off to a nearby noble. Not Henry. He kept them. And that was just the start. Over the years, his collection grew. A lynx, a porcupine, an elephant. Yes, an actual elephant, which he kept in a custom-built enclosure and insisted on feeding wine. And then there was the polar bear. Chained, yes, but allowed to swim in the Thames, where onlookers could gawk as it tried to catch fish. It was part spectacle, part public relations stunt, and entirely expensive. Meanwhile, England's finances were circling the drain. Wars on the continent, local rebellions, and endless construction projects drained the treasury. Henry was constantly begging Parliament for funds, while simultaneously spending those same funds on ivory-encrusted cages and animal trainers. When questioned, he brushed it off. The animals, he insisted, were symbols of England's grandeur, exotic emblems of royal reach, proof that even beasts from the far corners of the earth bowed, however reluctantly, to the English crown. But most people weren't impressed. Nobles rolled their eyes. Chroniclers noted the waste. One particularly dry monk wrote that Henry kept more beasts than barons at court and seemed to prefer the company of animals to men. Whether that was a criticism or a compliment, history leaves unclear. What is clear is that Henry's obsession with grandeur, whether in churches, castles, or caged predators, distracted from actual governance. Barons rebelled, Parliament grew more assertive, and the crown, once seen as untouchable, became something to negotiate with or challenge outright. Henry's zoo eventually became a curiosity for visitors. But for many of his contemporaries, it was a symbol of royal frivolity, of a king who collected lions while losing control of his realm. Still, if Henry's indulgence in wildlife was eccentric, his descendant Edward II took royal favoritism to bold new lows. Not content with just promoting his friends, Edward handed over the Queen's personal jewels to his most beloved companion, and then acted shocked when rebellion followed. 11. Edward II's disastrous favorite, Piers Gaveston. If Edward II had been born a stable boy, His fondness for charismatic companions and passionate distractions might have been harmless. But unfortunately for England, he was born king, and one of his earliest, most catastrophic acts of devotion was to elevate a man named Piers Gaveston from minor knight to royal obsession. Piers wasn't just Edward's favorite courtier. He was the gravitational center of Edward's attention. Charming, flashy, and endlessly smug, Gaveston wasn't shy about flaunting his new status. He wore luxurious clothes, mocked the barons to their faces, and strutted around the court like he had personally invented privilege. And Edward? He adored every minute of it. At a time when royal alliances were delicate, nobles were temperamental, and every gesture from the crown was weighed with suspicion, Edward II made the genius decision to ignore all that and hand over power, wealth, and influence to a man who delighted in antagonizing the entire political class. He didn't just promote Gaveston, he made him Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty, and showered him with jewels, lands, and titles, including, infamously, pieces from the Queen's personal jewelry. That queen was Isabella of France, daughter of the King of France, an actual princess whose marriage had been brokered to secure peace between two continental powers. She arrived in England expecting political gravitas, dignity, and maybe a functioning royal court. What she got was Edward doting on Gaveston in front of everyone, assigning him more influence than most seasoned advisors, and appearing more interested in their camaraderie than his own marriage. The barons, unsurprisingly, lost their minds. Many already distrusted Edward's ability to govern. His disinterest in military campaigns, his awkward public demeanor, his overconfidence in favorites. Gaveston's rise, paired with his open mockery of noble families, he called one the Black Dog of Ardennes, another the Old Hog, turned court politics into a blood feud. It all culminated in rebellion. Parliament demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward reluctantly agreed, and then secretly recalled him months later. The cycle repeated until things snapped. In 1312, a group of enraged barons captured Gaveston and executed him, without trial, on a remote hillside. A clear message: the nobility would not tolerate being ruled by proxy through a king's pet. Edward was devastated, but he didn't learn. He continued surrounding himself with a new set of favorites, the Despensers, triggering further unrest and eventually a full-blown civil war. His wife, Isabella, would later turn against him entirely, invading England with her lover and deposing Edward in favor of their son. But it all started with Gaveston, a man whose influence far outstripped his rank, whose arrogance matched his ambition, and whose presence exposed the fragility of Edward's rule. It was more than favoritism. It was political self-immolation disguised as loyalty. And if Edward's mistake was giving power to the wrong person, Henry VIII's mistake was believing he could still compete in the jousting ring while carrying the weight, quite literally, of a much older, much heavier version of his former self. 12. Henry VIII, jousting. While obese and in armor. By the 1530s, Henry VIII was not the dashing young prince who once wowed Europe with his athleticism and charm. He was nearing 50, well over 300 pounds, and suffering from chronic leg issues that made walking painful. But try telling him that. Henry, ever defiant of age and reality, continued to see himself as a paragon of virility, the ultimate Renaissance king, and nothing, in his mind, said king quite like a well-timed joust. Never mind that the sport involved heavy armor, charging at high speed, and a very real chance of injury. Henry had jousted in his youth, therefore he could still joust now. His court, of course, had no choice but to humor him. Saying no to Henry VIII, a man who founded his own church just to annul his first marriage, was a dangerous career move. So, in 1536, during a tournament at Greenwich, Henry mounted his horse, fully armored, determined to prove that time had not dulled his edge. What happened next wasn't just a fall. It was a catastrophe. Accounts vary in detail, but most agree that Henry was unhorsed violently. He hit the ground with such force that he was briefly unconscious. The entire court panicked. For several minutes, the King of England, the absolute center of national power, was motionless. Some thought he was dead. Others feared brain damage. The Queen, Anne Boleyn, reportedly fainted from shock. Henry survived, but he would never truly recover. His leg was badly injured, likely aggravated by existing ulcers, and the wound would plague him for the rest of his life. Infection set in. The injury never properly healed. He grew increasingly sedentary, paranoid, and volatile. His temper, already famous, worsened. His waistline ballooned further. By the end of his reign, he could barely walk and had to be hoisted onto his horse with mechanical assistance. The tragedy wasn't just medical. It was symbolic. This was the moment when Henry's myth, the handsome, athletic king, collided with reality. And rather than confront that reality, he doubled down. He turned to food, to paranoia, to cruelty. Executions increased. Advisors lived in fear. Wives became expendable. The man who once embodied Renaissance optimism transformed into a bitter, swollen shadow of his former self, all because he couldn't resist the urge to play knight one last time. But Henry wasn't the only monarch to chase an unattainable ideal. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would fight her own losing battle, not with horses, but with mortality itself. Her weapon of choice? A mask made of white lead, applied layer by toxic layer, in a desperate attempt to appear untouched by time. 13. Elizabeth I's lead-based makeup obsession. In the twilight of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I no longer resembled the vibrant, sharp-witted redhead who danced in jeweled gowns and issued defiant speeches before the Armada. By the early 1600s, she had become something else entirely, a ghostly apparition in lace and pearls, draped in myth and powder. A monarch so determined to conquer age that she tried to erase it entirely, with poison. Elizabeth's makeup routine wasn't just cosmetic, it was existential. It was power. At the heart of it all, a thick, chalky substance called Venetian ceruse, made from vinegar and white lead. It promised eternal youth. It delivered flaking skin, chemical burns, and premature aging. But for Elizabeth, it became her mask, both literal and symbolic. She began using it after a bout with smallpox in 1562 left her with facial scars. The disease nearly killed her. What it didn't take in health, it took in vanity. To the Queen, who had cultivated an image as the eternal Virgin Queen, semi-divine and unchanging, these imperfections were a political liability. So, she covered them, liberally, daily, obsessively. Her face grew whiter with each passing year. Portraits from the end of her reign show a figure almost inhuman in appearance. Alabaster skin, darkened lips, exaggerated eyes, and a towering red wig. Courtiers whispered that her real face hadn't been seen in decades. Some said even mirrors had been banned from her chambers. Others joked, cautiously, that Her Majesty was being embalmed one morning at a time. But the white mask came at a price. Venetian ceruse was corrosive. It slowly destroyed the skin it covered. The more she used it, the more damage it caused. And the more damage it caused, the more she needed to use. A perfect spiral of royal denial, where the cure became the disease. Yet no one dared stop her. To criticize the Queen's appearance was to question the monarchy itself. Her image had become a political artifact, carefully curated and strategically distributed. Elizabeth was not just a ruler, she was an icon, eternal, unblemished, suspended in time like a religious relic with a crown. Even as her health declined, she clung to the illusion. In her final years, she refused to go to bed, fearing she might not rise again. She stood for hours, cloaked in jewels and powder, refusing doctors, brushing off courtiers, mumbling prayers while her face cracked beneath its porcelain armor. It wasn't just vanity. It was fear. Fear of losing control, of being seen as frail, of watching her myth unravel. For decades, Elizabeth had ruled alone, unmatched and unchallenged. Now, as age closed in, her final act was a desperate attempt to preserve the fiction that she was still, somehow, untouched. And so, the Virgin Queen faded not with a bang, but beneath a layer of lead. Not a fall from grace, but a slow dissolve behind a painted smile. But if Elizabeth wore poison to hold on to youth, her sister Mary, Queen Mary made herself believe she was pregnant, with nothing but hope and public declarations. A queen undone not by illness or battle, but by a phantom child that never arrived. 14. Mary. I's phantom pregnancy fiasco. For Queen Mary I, the stakes couldn't have been higher. She wasn't just ruling England, she was trying to redeem it, to reverse the Protestant reforms of her father, Henry VIII, and her brother, Edward VI, to restore Catholicism, to secure the Tudor line. And to do that, she needed one thing above all: an heir. Mary was 37 when she married Philip II of Spain, a political alliance that was meant to solidify Catholic power in England and produce a future king. It was controversial from the start. Philip was foreign, aloof, and largely uninterested in England. Many in Mary's court viewed him as an opportunist. The public barely tolerated the match. But Mary was determined. She called him her true love, her partner, her path to redemption. So when, in 1554, she began to experience swelling, nausea, and missed periods, the court erupted in celebration. Mary was pregnant. She announced it publicly. Bells rang across the kingdom. Prayers were offered. Elizabeth, her half-sister and presumed heir, was placed under house arrest. The country prepared for a Catholic successor. The future was secure. There was just one problem. There was no child. Months passed. The due date came and went. Mary remained confined, convinced labor was imminent. Doctors whispered. Courtiers fidgeted. Foreign dignitaries began sending cautious letters home. Eventually, the whispers turned into rumors. Some suggested a miscarriage. Others hinted at deception. But the truth, as far as historians can tell, is more complicated and more tragic. Mary suffered what's now believed to have been a phantom pregnancy, a psychological condition in which the body mimics the symptoms of pregnancy driven by intense emotional or psychological need. Swelling, hormonal changes, even the sensation of fetal movement can occur. The body believes what the mind so desperately desires. And Mary desperately desired a child, not just for personal fulfillment, but for political survival. Without an heir, her efforts to restore Catholicism were temporary. Her reforms could be reversed. Her enemies, especially Elizabeth, could return. She needed this child to prove her reign was ordained, not merely tolerated. As weeks turned to months, hope turned to humiliation. The public, once jubilant, began to murmur. Foreign ambassadors mocked her behind closed doors. Even Philip quietly left the country. Mary was left with no child, no explanation, and a rapidly collapsing authority. The incident haunted her. She tried again in 1557, with similar results. Again, she was convinced she was pregnant. Again, there was no child. And this time, her health began to fail. By 1558, she was dead. Her legacy, intended to be one of religious triumph, became a cautionary tale of false hope and political fragility. But even in her downfall, there was something deeply human in Mary's belief. She wanted so badly for her future to exist, she imagined it into being. And in doing so, she reminded her kingdom, and us, that sometimes the most dangerous delusion is the one we need to believe. And belief, blind, stubborn, divine, would be the undoing of her successor, Charles I. A king so convinced that Parliament worked for him, he dissolved it entirely, and paid for that divine assumption with his crown. 15. Charles I's idea that Parliament worked for him. If you had to pick one monarch who misunderstood the job description of king, Charles I would be an outstanding candidate. Not because he was a tyrant, not because he was wildly incompetent, but because he genuinely believed that God had hired him directly, and everyone else, Parliament, the people, even the law, was just part of the royal admin team. Charles I wasn't power-hungry in the obvious way. He wasn't flamboyant, or theatrical, or even particularly charismatic. He was soft-spoken, devout, bookish, and absolutely immovable in his conviction that kings were divinely appointed and thus couldn't be questioned. His personal motto could have been, "If God didn't want me to have absolute power, why did he make me king?" This wasn't just a private opinion. Charles turned it into policy. From the moment he took the throne in 1625, he treated Parliament not as a governing body, but as a mildly annoying help desk. He summoned them when he needed money, usually for wars he couldn't afford, and dissolved them the moment they asked questions. Between 1629 and 1640, he ruled without Parliament entirely in what became known as the personal rule. His justification? Divine right. His reasoning? Parliament was meddling in things that didn't concern them, like the budget, or the law, or national religion. Charles introduced new taxes without consent. He revived medieval laws just to squeeze money out of his subjects. He sold titles like they were commemorative plates. People paid for the privilege of not being fined, and when they protested, he responded with a kind of royal confusion. Why were they upset? Didn't they know he was the law? Things got worse when Charles tried to enforce religious conformity. England was largely Protestant, but Charles favored a high church Anglican style that many thought looked suspiciously Catholic. His efforts to impose this style, especially in Scotland, sparked outright rebellion. To suppress it, he needed money, and to get money, he had to recall Parliament. Big mistake. When Parliament reconvened in 1640, they didn't come to negotiate. They came with grievances, fury, and a list of demands. Charles predictably refused to compromise. He tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament in person, in the House of Commons. They fled. London erupted in outrage. The breach of protocol was so severe it pushed the country into civil war. The English Civil War wasn't a simple clash of armies. It was a total collapse of consensus. Royalists fought for the king. Parliamentarians fought for a reimagined future. Through it all, Charles remained oddly serene, convinced that God would vindicate him. Spoiler, he didn't. Charles lost the war. He was captured, tried for treason, a bizarre, almost surreal moment in English history where a king stood trial before his own people and was sentenced to death. The divine right of kings ended with a sword, a platform, and an executioner in black. To the very end, Charles insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he was a martyr, that he died not for crime, but for monarchy itself. And in a sense, he was right. He didn't die because he was evil. He died because he was deluded, a man who mistook absolute confidence for absolute authority. Still, if Charles believed Parliament was his personal office, Edward II had another kind of blind spot, a romantic one. Specifically, he believed it was perfectly reasonable to hand his wife's crown jewels to his male favorites, and then act surprised when war broke out. 16. Edward II, giving his wife's jewelry to his male favorites. Edward II wasn't subtle. Not in politics, not in war, and definitely not in matters of personal attachment. As if promoting Piers Gaveston to near-regal heights hadn't been enough of a scandal, Edward upped the ante by using royal resources and personal symbols to express his affection for the next in line of favorites, the Despensers. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger. Arrogant, ruthless, and perfectly tuned to exploit Edward's need for companionship, Hugh quickly became the new power behind the throne. He was rewarded accordingly, with lands, titles, influence, and the Queen's personal belongings. Yes, her actual crown jewels. Isabella of France, Edward's wife, wasn't just a foreign royal consort. She was a diplomatic bridge between England and France. A woman raised in a court where protocol, honor, and appearances mattered deeply. And she arrived in England expecting, at the very least, to be respected as queen. What she got instead was humiliation. Edward's decision to give her jewelry to Despenser wasn't just a private insult, it was public. The transfer of royal items symbolized favor, power, legitimacy. By handing Isabella's possessions to Hugh, Edward was telling the court, and the country, who really mattered. Isabella was furious. So were the nobles. They already despised the Despensers for their greed and brutality. Now, the favoritism had escalated into full-blown provocation. It wasn't just bad optics. It was the equivalent of slapping the political elite with a jeweled glove. Edward didn't back down. He doubled down. He allowed Hugh to imprison opponents without trial. Lands were confiscated. Torture was employed. The monarchy became a family business, with Hugh acting as co-king and Isabella treated as royal wallpaper. But Isabella wasn't the type to fade quietly. She bided her time. Then she struck. In 1325, under the pretext of a diplomatic mission, she traveled to France and refused to return. Instead, she aligned herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled noble with an axe to grind. Together, they raised an army, invaded England, and swiftly overthrew Edward. By 1327, Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his own son. Hugh Despenser was executed, and Edward, deposed and imprisoned. His reign, already fragile, ended in disgrace. But the root of the rebellion wasn't military failure or administrative collapse. It was personal arrogance. Edward had confused private indulgence with public impunity. In a world built on alliances and image, he chose personal favoritism over national stability, and the price was paid in bloodless rooms and empty thrones. Favoritism may have doomed Edward, but his distant descendant, Henry VI, would take royal detachment to ecclesiastical levels, spending his reign building colleges and cathedrals while his kingdom tore itself apart, one brick at a time. 17. Henry VI, founding colleges, while his kingdom burned. There are kings who rule with an iron fist, others with a silver tongue. And then there's Henry VI, who ruled with a quill, a Bible, and a deep emotional attachment to Gothic architecture. If Henry V, his father, had been a warlord in armor, Henry VI was more like a somber librarian trapped in a crown. From his earliest years, it was clear he wasn't built for conflict. While England battled rebellions, rival factions, and the slow collapse of its overseas empire, Henry remained preoccupied with a different legacy entirely, one made of stone, prayer, and ivy-covered ambition. In 1440, Henry founded Eton College, a school intended to provide a proper, pious education for poor boys, to nurture virtue, as the charter insisted. A noble cause, no doubt. But the timing? Spectacularly tone-deaf. England was financially strained, politically fractured, and increasingly divided by what would soon become the Wars of the Roses. The treasury was bleeding, but Henry was fundraising, not for armies or famine relief, but for a chapel. And not just any chapel. Eton's chapel, modeled after the grandest European cathedrals, was designed to be a shining monument to Christian learning and Lancastrian glory. Tall stained glass windows, flying buttresses, endless Latin inscriptions. Meanwhile, the nobility were busy hiring mercenaries, fortifying castles and choosing sides. Henry's interest in education didn't stop with Eton. He also founded King's College, Cambridge, linking the two institutions in a kind of dynastic academic pipeline. Scholars still marvel at the grandeur of the designs. The vision was immense, but so was the disconnect. While Henry obsessed over syllabi, England was falling apart. Powerful nobles, like Richard, Duke of York, began questioning Henry's authority. The court split into factions. The crown lost control of its own military. In 1453, the same year Henry's chapel work was accelerating, he suffered a complete mental breakdown, retreating into catatonia for over a year. But even after his partial recovery, Henry didn't adjust course. He was a man out of time, out of touch, and increasingly out of power. Instead of asserting leadership, he spent hours in religious contemplation, reportedly weeping during services and scribbling notes on scripture. Advisors were ignored. Wars were neglected. By the mid-1450s, rival claimants were openly mobilizing forces. When the Wars of the Roses began in earnest, Henry was often more symbol than sovereign, dragged from place to place, occasionally crowned again, always passive. Even during the rare moments of restored power, he showed no appetite for ruling. He spoke of reconciliation while armies marched. He pondered theology as towns burned. And yet, there's a strange irony in his legacy. His colleges endured. Eton and King's still stand, centuries later, revered as institutions of elite education. They have educated prime ministers, poets, and princes, which is more than can be said for the kingdom Henry tried to hold together. He may have failed as a king, but he succeeded as a patron of learning. And in a way, that's the tragedy. Henry VI was a gentleman with the heart of a monk, born into a crown-shaped disaster. But if Henry died lost in thought, King John, one of his less spiritual predecessors, died in a state of gastrointestinal chaos following a feast of peaches and cider. And some say, in a final act of royal clumsiness, he may have even starved himself to death, entirely by accident. 18. King John starving himself to death. Possibly by accident. It's hard to decide whether King John's death was the final punctuation mark on a disastrous reign, or just the last in a long string of bizarre, self-inflicted failures. Either way, it ended, fittingly, in embarrassment. By 1216, John was already infamous. He had alienated the barons, lost nearly all of England's holdings in France, been excommunicated by the Pope, and forced into signing the Magna Carta. Public approval hovered somewhere between deep suspicion and, let's replace him with literally anyone. As civil war raged and France threatened to invade, John attempted a desperate campaign to reclaim lost ground in the East. His journey was erratic, much like his leadership style. He burned villages on a whim, ignored advice, and managed to drive his treasure-laden baggage train into a swamp, losing the crown jewels in the tidal flats of the Wash. That alone would have been enough to secure him a place in royal mockery history. But John wasn't done. While fleeing from rebel forces, he took refuge at Newark Castle. There, he reportedly dined on a surfeit of peaches and new cider. Chroniclers differ on the details. Some say the fruit was unripe. Others claim the cider was tainted. Still others whisper of poison. But the most plausible explanation, and the most tragically on brand, is simply this. John overate, got violently ill, and refused to eat anything afterward. In the days following the feast, he developed a fever and severe digestive issues. As his condition worsened, he stopped eating altogether. Whether it was due to pain, depression, or a tantrum, no one knows. But as his body weakened, he reportedly refused treatment, praying and mumbling to monks while his inner circle panicked. And then, in a moment that feels more like grim satire than royal tragedy, he starved to death. Not from lack of food, but from self-neglect. A final, ironic echo of how he'd governed his realm. He'd mismanaged his kingdom into rebellion, mismanaged his army into a swamp, mismanaged his own health into a grave. Even in death, John managed to confuse his legacy. Some monks claimed his demise was divine punishment. Others suggested he died piously, in repentance. A few saw it as a warning that even kings could be undone not by enemies, but by their own habits. The truth, as always, is murkier. But one thing remains clear. King John was a man of disastrous timing, worse instincts, and astonishing miscalculation. His reign ended not with a bang, but with bloating, fever, and the slow, avoidable unraveling of his body and kingdom alike. If Henry VI tried to rule as a saint, and King John expired like a man who didn't read the menu warnings, then James I brought a new flavor of royal madness, one that saw demonic forces behind every thunderstorm and crooked cow. A king so obsessed with witches, he became the most paranoid sorcerer-hunter in English royal history. 19. James's obsession with witches. Most kings worry about taxes, treaties, and the occasional political assassination. James I, on the other hand, worried about witches. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. He was convinced that a network of broomstick-riding, storm-summoning women were actively trying to kill him, sometimes by weather, sometimes by cursed dolls, and occasionally by giving cows indigestion. To be fair, James had a stressful job. He became King of Scotland at 13 months old, after his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate. He later inherited the English throne in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. It was a grand political moment, the dawn of a new era. So naturally, James decided to spend much of it talking about witches. His obsession began in earnest during a stormy sea voyage in 1590, when he was returning from Denmark with his new bride Anne. The ship was battered by violent weather, nearly wrecked, and James, never one to settle for a natural explanation, decided it must have been sorcery. A group of Scottish women were accused of conjuring the storm, and under torture, confessed to targeting the king himself. This was all the proof James needed. Nature, he reasoned, did not simply misbehave in the presence of monarchs. Someone had to be blamed. From that point on, he became a man possessed by fear, not spirits. He personally oversaw interrogations. He questioned suspects. He wrote Demonology, a full-length treatise explaining how witches operated, how to identify them, and why they were a threat to the realm. The book read like a guide for the spiritually terrified, blending theology, folklore, and shaky science into a manual that insisted the devil was not only real, but actively recruiting your neighbors. In England, this paranoia spread. Trials increased. Accusations were treated with increasing seriousness. James believed witches could cause plagues, miscarriages, bad harvests, and even royal misfortune. When people died mysteriously, or, more often, inconveniently, he saw a supernatural explanation behind every sudden cough and failed harvest. His courtiers humored him, as courtiers do. After all, it's one thing to tell your king that his political strategy needs work. It's quite another to inform him that thunderstorms aren't proof of demonic plots. Ambassadors from other countries wrote letters home describing James as learned, nervous, and prone to mystical fears, which is diplomatic shorthand for, "This man is interviewing goats." Even as he promoted religious tolerance in other areas, authorizing the King James Bible, for instance, James refused to let go of his witch obsession. He saw himself as a divinely appointed bulwark against evil, a modern-day Solomon with holy insight. Unfortunately, this self-image meant people suffered under baseless suspicion and poor science. What's perhaps most fascinating is that James wasn't stupid. He was well-read, politically astute, and capable of clever diplomacy, but his intellect came wrapped in superstition. He believed the supernatural could be systematized, cataloged, ruled over, like any part of the monarchy, which meant he approached witch hunting not as a mania, but as governance, a royal duty. The irony? Toward the end of his reign, James began to doubt some of the trials he had once promoted. In one case, he personally intervened to overturn a verdict, sensing that the accused had been framed. But by then, the damage had been done. The fear had taken root. James III left behind a legacy of religious consolidation, literary achievement, and international diplomacy, but also a trail of paranoia, burned bridges, and scorched village commons. His reign proved that fear, even when dressed in robes and quoting scripture, can still smell like smoke. And if James feared witches for their supposed ability to unmake order, then Henry VIII tackled his own unraveling through something far more personal and equally disastrous. The systematic reinvention of his love life, 6 marriages deep, powered by ego, insecurity, and a midlife crisis that ended with an entirely new religion. 20. Henry VIII's 6 wives' solution to his midlife crisis. There are midlife crises, and then there's Henry VIII, a man who responded to aging not by buying a horse, but by becoming the supreme head of the Church of England and rewriting the religious structure of an entire continent. All because his first wife wasn't producing male heirs fast enough. It started innocently enough. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow, in a politically convenient union that began with optimism. She was pious, intelligent, and respected. But as the years dragged on and pregnancy after pregnancy ended in tragedy or stillbirth, the one surviving child, a daughter, Mary, became a growing disappointment in the royal mind. Henry, like every king raised on divine right bedtime stories, believed his legacy rested on a male heir. No son, no stability. No stability, no Tudor dynasty. But the Church, specifically the Pope, refused to grant an annulment. Henry was trapped in a marriage he no longer believed in, with a wife he claimed God was punishing him for taking. His solution? Invent a theological loophole, push his advisors to find scriptural justification, and when that didn't work, sever ties with Rome entirely. Thus was born the English Reformation, not from a groundswell of religious conviction, but from one man's deeply personal grievance. With the stroke of a royal pen, England's spiritual authority shifted from the Pope to the Crown. Monasteries were dissolved, lands seized, dissenters punished, and a new Anglican church took shape, all so Henry could legally marry a second woman. That second wife, Anne Boleyn, was smart, stylish, and politically savvy. But she too failed to deliver a male heir. Her only child was a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But in the moment, was just another disappointment to her increasingly unstable father. Anne's fate was sealed as Henry's affections cooled and paranoia bloomed. She was arrested, charged with crimes that most modern historians agree were fabricated, and removed with the finality Henry had come to prefer. Within weeks, Henry married Jane Seymour, who finally delivered the long-awaited son, Edward VI, but died soon after childbirth, cementing her in Henry's mind as the one true wife, because she fulfilled her biological assignment. 3 wives down. Then came Anne of Cleves, selected from abroad via portrait, a Tinder marriage centuries early. Henry, upon meeting her in person, claimed she looked nothing like her picture and had the face of a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled after a matter of months. To Anne's credit, she survived, given a generous settlement and allowed to remain in England, wisely declining to press her luck. Wife 5, Catherine Howard, was a teenager when Henry married her. Henry himself now bloated, paranoid, and in his 40s with a festering leg wound and a diminishing tolerance for humiliation. Catherine was executed for adultery within 2 years. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, intelligent, diplomatic, and perhaps most importantly, politically cautious. She managed to outlive Henry, caring for him during his final years and navigating court intrigue with practiced calm. When he died in 1547, she became the only one of Henry's 6 wives to simultaneously survive the marriage and maintain her head. Across these 6 marriages, Henry's legacy became not one of personal growth, but of political upheaval, institutional reform, and interpersonal catastrophe. The dissolution of monasteries, the suppression of Catholic resistance, and the realignment of English spirituality weren't the result of widespread revolution. They were the collateral damage of one man's relentless pursuit of dynastic satisfaction. And ironically, his prized heir, Edward VI, died young. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would both take the throne, rendering his obsession with sons not just tragic, but unnecessary. The Tudor line was continued not by the boy he broke England for, but by the girls he overlooked. If Henry VIII thought the answer to his insecurities was found at the altar, his son Charles II would look for answers in the laboratory. Because when the monarchy returned from exile, Charles came back not only with a taste for luxury, but also for science, and more than one way to accidentally gas your own courtiers in the name of curiosity. 21. Charles II's scientific experiments gone wrong. Charles II may have returned to the throne with Restoration flair, velvet robes, elaborate court pageants, and a flair for personal indulgence. But beneath the powdered wigs and flirtatious banter was a king with a serious hobby: science. He loved it, admired it, funded it, encouraged it, and, on more than one occasion, nearly blew up his palace with it. After 11 years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, England was tired of piety. Charles's return in 1660 brought back music, theater, dancing, and, rather unexpectedly, experimental chemistry. Charles was no mere patron of the sciences. He considered himself an amateur scientist. He was a founding member of the Royal Society and surrounded himself with people like Robert Hooke, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton. These were not polite dinner companions. These were men who liked to poke things with sticks, heat them until they exploded, and then name the results after themselves. Charles wanted in. He set up his own private laboratory in Whitehall Palace, where he and his royal companions would engage in all sorts of experiments, from blood transfusions to the distillation of mercury. Courtiers reportedly tiptoed around the lab, fearing accidental combustion. And they were right to be nervous. On more than one occasion, Charles released noxious fumes into the air by mistake. One experiment, involving mercury and possibly sulfur, ended with several courtiers vomiting and fleeing the room. Another attempt at burning saltpeter created a chemical cloud so dense that part of the palace had to be evacuated. None of this discouraged Charles. He remained convinced that the secrets of the universe could be discovered between diplomatic meetings and afternoon strolls. He had a telescope installed on the roof, personally observed eclipses, and even performed dissections. A king elbow-deep in anatomy, equal parts curiosity and horror to those around him. Yet Charles's scientific enthusiasm often clashed with his political responsibilities. While he was peering through lenses and fiddling with crucibles, the government was managing economic turmoil, religious tensions, and two major catastrophes: the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666. His response to both crises was mixed. He showed up, gave speeches, provided resources, and then promptly retreated to his workshop to investigate the physics of burning wood. Still, Charles's legacy in science wasn't just a matter of misfires and toxic clouds. He helped formalize scientific inquiry in England. Under his reign, the Royal Society flourished, developing peer review, funding research, and promoting the idea that knowledge was something to be tested, not just inherited from ancient texts. But let's be honest, it's hard not to laugh at the image of England's monarch, robes hiked up, goggles askew, waving smoke out of a window after accidentally gassing his advisors. It's the Restoration version of "I meant to do that." He wasn't a bad king, just a man with a Bunsen burner and too much unstructured time. And yet, even his most reckless experiments pale in comparison to the sheer theatrical collapse of Richard III, a king who charged into battle, lost everything in minutes, and shouted a final line so dramatic it's still quoted today. 22. Richard III, riding into battle, shouting, "A horse! A horse!" History rarely remembers its losers kindly, and Richard III, last Plantagenet King of England, is no exception. His death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 wasn't just a battlefield loss. It was a full-scale theatrical collapse, punctuated by one of the most enduring, tragicomic lines ever shouted by a monarch on his way out. A horse. A horse. My kingdom for a horse. Let's rewind. Richard had seized the throne in 1483 under questionable circumstances. His young nephew, Edward V, was declared illegitimate and quietly disappeared from the Tower of London, a mystery that still haunts historians. Richard, then Duke of Gloucester, was crowned instead. The country was suspicious, the nobles cautious, but Richard was determined. He presented himself as a reformer, a just ruler, and a man of law. He tried, genuinely, to improve administration and expand justice. But it didn't matter. Whispers about the vanished princes followed him everywhere, and the Tudor faction, led by Henry Tudor, was gaining strength abroad. By 1485, Henry landed in Wales with an army and marched toward confrontation. Richard, sensing the threat, rode out to meet him. Bosworth Field was supposed to be the moment he reaffirmed his rule. Instead, it became his undoing. The battle was close. Richard led from the front, brave, aggressive, maybe even reckless. When he spotted Henry Tudor surrounded by only a few bodyguards, he saw an opportunity to end the conflict in one charge. It was a bold move, the kind of gamble that could make a king into a legend, or a cautionary footnote. He rallied his knights and charged directly at Henry. For a brief, astonishing moment, it worked. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer. He came within a sword's reach of ending the Tudor claim right there in the mud, and then his horse was killed. Suddenly, Richard was on foot, surrounded, the tide of battle turning. His allies, sensing doom, began to flee. Among them was Lord Stanley, whose forces Richard had counted on, but who switched sides mid-battle. Now isolated, Richard fought on. Eyewitnesses described him hacking down enemies like a man possessed. But possession doesn't win against odds like that. And then came the fateful cry. A horse. A horse. My kingdom for a horse. It's unclear if he actually said it. Shakespeare certainly thought so. But the line stuck because it felt true. Here was a king, desperate and bloodied, trading an entire realm for a way out. Not for glory, not for vengeance, just for transportation. He was cut down in the melee. His crown, according to legend, was found under a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head, the birth of the Tudor dynasty and the death of Plantagenet rule. But Richard's legacy didn't end there. His body was unceremoniously buried, lost for centuries, and finally rediscovered in 2012 under a parking lot in Leicester. DNA confirmed the identity. Historians reevaluated his reign. Was he a villain? A reformer? A tragic figure manipulated by propaganda? The truth, like most things medieval, remains shrouded in rumor and hindsight. What we do know is that Richard died fighting. Not in retreat, not in surrender, but in a last, doomed attempt to change his fate. It was heroic, stupid, and deeply human. A fitting end to a king who never quite managed to convince the world he belonged on the throne. And if Richard's downfall came from too much courage, Edward VI came from too much confidence in paperwork. A teenage king who rewrote the line of succession with a pen, thinking he could outmaneuver Parliament, the public, and his own mortality. Spoiler, he couldn't. 23. Edward VI, writing his own succession plan. Edward VI was 15 years old, chronically ill, and deeply convinced that he could outsmart the laws of inheritance, the will of the people, and the basic forces of history, all with a well-worded legal memo. He had been born into unimaginable pressure. Son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, Edward was the golden boy England had been waiting for, the legitimate male heir Henry had risked an entire religious schism to produce. But his birth was followed by the immediate death of his mother, and by the time Edward actually came of age to rule, he was a pale, intelligent, coughing teenager with a Protestant tutor and a rapidly deteriorating set of lungs. Still, When he inherited the throne in 1547 at the age of 9, he did so with all the pomp the Tudors could summon. The government, however, was run by regents. First his uncle Edward Seymour, then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Edward might have been young, but he wasn't stupid. He was fiercely intellectual, obsessed with theology, and a die-hard Protestant. And when he realized he might not live long enough to see England fully reformed, he took matters into his own hands, or more accurately, his own ink-stained fingers. The problem was the line of succession. By law, and by his father's will, if Edward died without an heir, the crown would pass to his older half-sister Mary. Unfortunately for Edward, Mary was Catholic. Fiercely, stubbornly, publicly Catholic. To him, allowing Mary to become queen would be like setting fire to the entire Protestant Reformation. So, in a flurry of legal scribbling, Edward decided to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth, naming Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his successor. Jane was young, pious, politically innocent, and, importantly, controllable. Her marriage to Northumberland's son made things even tidier for those in power. The succession was rewritten. Parliament hadn't approved it, but Edward assumed they'd go along. After all, he was the king. And kings, even wheezing teenage ones, don't expect pushback from the realm. Edward died in July 1553, after months of illness, his body racked with what historians believe was likely tuberculosis. As he faded, he remained certain that his plan would work, that England would follow his written word, that the people would prioritize religious continuity over dynastic tradition. They didn't. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, and almost immediately regretted it. She didn't want the crown. Her reign lasted a full 9 days before Mary gathered popular support and marched into London with the confidence of someone who'd been underestimated one too many times. The country, weary of backroom politics and power-hungry regents, rallied behind the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Mary was no reformer, but she was legitimate, and legitimacy still mattered. Jane was imprisoned. Edward's carefully plotted plan unraveled faster than his health had. Within a year, Mary was queen, the Protestant reforms were under siege, and Lady Jane Grey, tragically, inevitably, was executed. Edward VI had imagined himself a second Solomon, reshaping the kingdom with wisdom and foresight. In reality, he was a teenager with a quill and a conviction, trying to legislate from the edge of the grave. His error wasn't malice, it was arrogance, the kind that comes from being told your entire life that you were chosen, special, ordained to rule. He believed his word could override centuries of precedent and popular sentiment. He learned, too late, that thrones aren't secured by logic. They're secured by loyalty, legitimacy, and luck, none of which were on his side by the end. And if Edward was a tragic figure playing chess with history, Henry VII, his grandfather, played a different game entirely. Not the game of heroics or high drama, but of cold calculation, tax receipts, and a pathological obsession with money that made him the most frugal monarch in English history, and possibly the first royal accountant with a crown. 24. Henry VII's tax obsession. If Henry VIII ruled with appetite and flair, his father, Henry VII, ruled like a man trying to save for a rainy day that never arrived. The founder of the Tudor dynasty wasn't interested in pageantry, conquest, or romantic scandal. He was interested in accounts, specifically in balancing them, to the point of obsession. Henry VII came to power in 1485 after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a civil conflict so bloody and prolonged that it left the crown unstable, the nobility fractured, and the treasury dangerously empty. Henry, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, knew what it cost to win the throne, and he had no intention of losing it. Ever. His response? Turn the English monarchy into something resembling a late medieval tax office. He began collecting money with a seriousness that bordered on the devotional. Under Henry's rule, Fines, fees, levies, dues, bonds, recognizances, and obscure medieval taxes were all dusted off, inflated, and enforced with ruthless consistency. You could be fined for illegal hunting, for land disputes, for being on the wrong side during the last rebellion, or, in some cases, for simply wearing the wrong color cloak at court. It wasn't about justice, it was about revenue, and Henry had a system. He used loyal bureaucrats like the infamous Empson and Dudley to squeeze wealth from the nobility with surgical precision. They were nicknamed the tax twins, though few nobles found their methods cute. If a family had land, Henry found a way to tax it. If a noble made a show of wealth, Henry fined him for not getting permission first. If a baron smiled too widely, Henry might have charged him for improper use of morale. Nothing escaped his eye. He kept meticulous personal records, not just delegating finances, but actively participating in tracking them. Pages and pages of his handwritten accounts survive, filled with tiny notes and marginalia about who owed what, who paid late, and how many pounds had been squeezed from which manor. He also hoarded the money. While other kings spent on palaces or foreign adventures, Henry saved. He stockpiled gold in chests beneath the Tower of London. By the end of his reign, he had amassed a fortune estimated at over $1.8 million in today's currency, an enormous sum for the period. He rarely threw feasts. He didn't throw tournaments. He barely traveled. He governed like a man who believed the crown could vanish if he blinked. To his credit, the policy worked, at least fiscally. England emerged from the 15th century's dynastic anarchy with a functioning government, a padded treasury, and no immediate foreign debt. But politically, it was a different story. The nobility despised him. The commoners grumbled under his labyrinth of fines. Even his own son, Henry VIII, would later execute Empson and Dudley as a kind of symbolic house-cleaning. Henry VII's reputation became that of a grim-faced being, counter in royal robes. He had no appetite for charm, no interest in splendor. He didn't laugh in public. He didn't entertain poetry or music. His idea of legacy was not chiseled in stone, but inked into ledgers. And yet, in a quietly ironic twist, his obsession with saving money didn't save him from illness. He died in 1509, worn out and unpopular. His funeral, though grand by necessity, felt more like the close of a long audit than the farewell to a beloved king. His son, Henry VIII, would go on to blow through that entire fortune in record time. But before that tale of indulgence kicks in again, we turn to another queen from Henry VII's lineage, his daughter-in-law Mary I, who, in her zeal to unite England with Spain, handed over her throne, her independence, and much of her court's respect in the name of a royal marriage that never quite loved her back. 25. Queen Mary. I Spanish over-enthusiasm. When Queen Mary Went of England married Philip II of Spain in 1554, she believed she was securing a divine alliance, a Catholic revival, and a lifelong partnership. What she actually secured was a deeply awkward diplomatic arrangement, a husband who barely tolerated her, and a court that muttered behind closed doors about her increasingly alarming devotion, not to England, but to Spain. Mary wasn't just England's first queen regnant. She was a monarch with a mission. After years of Protestant reform under her father, Henry VIII, and her brother, Edward VI, Mary saw it as her sacred duty to bring England back to the true faith. That meant Rome. That meant ritual. And that, most importantly to Mary, meant Catholic alliances, which is where Philip II came in, heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, devoutly Catholic, and unfortunately, profoundly disinterested. Philip did not love Mary. He barely even liked her. Reports from the Spanish court prior to the wedding describe him preparing for the trip like a man being sent to exile rather than into marriage. He agreed only after intense pressure from his father, Emperor Charles V, and only with a list of conditions designed to limit his involvement in English politics. Mary, by contrast, was deeply devoted. She had seen visions, prayed earnestly, and was convinced that this union was God's reward for her faith. She even had their royal insignias entwined before the ceremony, with one chronicler describing her expression at the wedding as one of trembling joy. The English people, however, did not share her enthusiasm. The idea of a Spanish king ruling over England, even as a consort, sent waves of anxiety through Parliament and the general public. Memories of Spanish interference on the continent, combined with fear of Catholic overreach, produced riots in the streets and even sparked Wyatt's rebellion, a failed uprising that nearly unseated Mary before the marriage had even taken place. She responded with executions and increased surveillance, believing, perhaps rightly, that Protestant plots were everywhere. But the real embarrassment came not from rebellion, but from the marriage itself. Philip, cold and formal, spent as little time in England as possible. He spoke little English, found court life tedious, and considered Mary politically useful but emotionally taxing. After she believed herself pregnant in 1555, a phantom pregnancy that made headlines across Europe and ended in humiliating anticlimax, Philip began to spend even less time by her side. He left the country, returned to Spain, and sent only occasional letters, most of them diplomatic in tone. Mary, for her part, continued to insist on co-sovereignty. She had coins minted with both their faces. She added his name to official proclamations. She even altered English protocols to include Spanish styles of address. All of it created the impression, among courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike, that England was slowly becoming a Habsburg satellite. It wasn't. But Mary's insistence on treating Philip as a co-monarch despite his visible discomfort made her look increasingly deluded. It wasn't just a political miscalculation. It was a personal vulnerability exposed on the world stage. She had risked her reign on a man who viewed her crown as a seasonal obligation. Eventually, Philip became King of Spain in his own right and stopped visiting England altogether. Mary's hope for a joint empire evaporated. Her second phantom pregnancy in 1557 confirmed the final blow. No heir, no legacy, no future for the Catholic dynasty she had tried to build. She died in 1558, broken-hearted, still professing love for a husband who never quite came back. Mary's reign is often remembered for its religious persecutions, but her personal misjudgments, particularly in marriage, were equally damaging. She mistook ceremonial unity for emotional loyalty. She imagined herself as half of a sacred royal pair. What she got was a paper husband and a nation that never stopped questioning her judgment. But while Mary's downfall came from loving too hard, Elizabeth I, her half-sister and successor, made the opposite mistake, loving no one enough, or at least not naming anyone to follow her. Her deathbed indecision over the succession nearly plunged the country back into chaos, all because she couldn't bear to say who came next. 26. Elizabeth I's deathbed. Indecision. For a queen so famously decisive in life, Elizabeth I was remarkably indecisive in death. The woman who had once stared down the Spanish Armada, commanded generations of poets and spies, and ruled England with razor-sharp instinct for over 4 decades could not, or would not, do the one thing her counselors begged her to do: name a successor. It wasn't for lack of options. By the final years of her reign, the most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of Mary, Queen of Scots, a man with royal blood, political experience, and a strong claim. Elizabeth knew this. Her ministers knew this. Europe knew this. And yet, when pressed, the Queen famously answered the question of succession with the verbal equivalent of a sideways glance. "I will have no other sepulchre but the hearts of my people," she once declared. It was poetic, regal, and completely unhelpful. To understand Elizabeth's refusal, one must first understand her style. She had ruled as the Virgin Queen, a monarch who married her country instead of a man. Her image was deliberately aloof, almost mythic. By avoiding marriage and heirs, she kept power centralized and personal. She was not a Tudor mother. She was Gloriana, the eternal queen. To name a successor was to admit that her reign would end, and for a ruler whose legitimacy had been questioned since birth, that admission felt dangerously close to weakness. Still, as she aged into her 70s, surrounded by fading courtiers and the ghosts of long-dead suitors, the question became unavoidable. The country had no official heir. Parliament grew nervous. Advisors grew desperate. Rumors circulated about coups, civil war, and foreign interference should she die without a clear transition. And yet, silence. In early 1603, Elizabeth fell seriously ill. Accounts describe her growing weak, melancholic, withdrawn. She refused to take to her bed, insisting that queens don't lie down to die. She sat for hours in a darkened room, fully dressed, in a chair, refusing food and whispering prayers. When her ministers begged her to name James, she reportedly made a vague gesture, lifting her hand, which they chose to interpret as agreement. That single gesture was the sum total of her endorsement. She died days later, still queen in name, but having left the succession to be interpreted rather than declared. England, mercifully, accepted the signal. James VI of Scotland became James III of England, ushering in the Stuart dynasty and the union of crowns. But only by default, not decree. The transition was peaceful, but it could easily have been otherwise. Had multiple claimants stepped forward, or had James faced stronger opposition, England could have been thrown into yet another dynastic crisis. The Tudors had spent generations clawing their way to security, and Elizabeth, in her final act, gambled it all on silence. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps, in true Elizabethan fashion, it was politics, the final power play of a queen who never wanted to share the stage, even as the curtain was falling. She left no will, no written declaration, no last speech to guide the country, just legends, portraits, and a throne waiting to be claimed. And if Elizabeth's silence nearly triggered instability, James II would ensure it, not through silence, but through secrecy. A king so oblivious to the climate of his kingdom that he quietly baptized his son, a Catholic in staunchly Protestant England, and acted surprised when riots broke out. 27. James II. Baptizing his son as Catholic in secret. If you were the King of England in the late 1600s, there was one thing, just one, that was guaranteed to ignite political panic, public outrage, and possibly revolution, announcing that your heir was a Catholic. So naturally, James II decided to do it in the most suspicious, inflammatory way possible, in secret, without warning, and in the dead center of a Protestant country still traumatized by its last flirtation with Catholic monarchs. James had already been testing England's patience. Unlike his brother Charles II, who outwardly embraced Anglicanism while quietly maintaining Catholic sympathies, James didn't bother with the facade. He was openly Catholic, devoutly so, and he saw his monarchy as a divine mandate to re-Catholicize a country that had made a business out of burning popes in effigy. From the moment he took the throne in 1685, tension buzzed through Parliament like static before a lightning strike. At first, there was some restraint. James was in his 50s. His daughters, Mary and Anne, were staunch Protestants, and the prevailing assumption was that the crown would pass peacefully to them once their father passed. The country could tolerate a Catholic king if it meant a Protestant future. Then, in 1688, everything changed. James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a child who would be raised as a Catholic and who now leapfrogged the king's Protestant daughters in the line of succession. The response was not celebration, it was panic. This wasn't just a royal birth, it was a dynastic earthquake. The specter of a Catholic dynasty, of England being dragged back under papal influence, suddenly became real. And just to ensure maximum drama, James decided to keep the child's baptism secret, away from public ceremony, in a private Catholic rite, performed by a Jesuit priest. No public declaration, no Anglican blessing, no effort to reassure the Protestant majority. Just a quiet, candlelit ceremony whispered behind closed chapel doors. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Rumors flew. Some claimed the child wasn't real, that a baby had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan to fake a birth. Others claimed the king had deliberately bypassed Parliament to engineer a Catholic succession. The fact that no trusted Protestant witnesses were present during the birth only fanned the flames. It was a conspiracy theorist's paradise, and for once, even the sane people were suspicious. James, in classic Stuart fashion, seemed baffled by the outrage. He believed with stunning sincerity that the English people would simply accept his choices, that his divine right would carry him through the storm, that a private baptism was a private matter. It wasn't. Within months, a coalition of English nobles quietly reached out to William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law and husband to Mary. They invited him to invade, not just to intervene, to replace the king. And in November of 1688, William landed in England. James's army dissolved around him. His supporters vanished. His own daughter turned against him. He fled to France, dropping the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames on the way out, as if to erase his own authority with a splash. Parliament declared the throne vacant, and William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs in what became known, rather optimistically, as the Glorious Revolution. James would spend the rest of his life in exile, insisting on the legitimacy of his Catholic son's claim. That son, the Old Pretender, would go on to become the rallying point for the Jacobite uprisings, attempting to reclaim the throne in the name of a Catholic England that no longer existed. All because one king, convinced of his own untouchable authority, baptized a baby in secret and assumed that centuries of religious paranoia would just politely ignore it. But while James II was undone by secrecy, his ancestor Henry V chose the opposite approach. Full-blown spectacle, glorious speeches, and reckless, mud-soaked warfare, including one siege so poorly managed it turned his triumphant campaign into a literal latrine of suffering. 28. Henry V's reckless siege of Harfleur. Henry V is remembered as one of England's great warrior kings, the hero of Agincourt, the silver-tongued orator who turned outnumbered soldiers into legend. But even the brightest medieval stars cast long shadows, and few moments in his reign cast as foul a one as the siege of Harfleur in 1415, a campaign that began with the sound of trumpets and ended with the stench of dysentery. The plan was simple: invade France, lay claim to the throne, and secure a strategic base on the Normandy coast, beginning with the port town of Harfleur. The logic was sound. Harfleur was fortified, important, and symbolic. Take it, and the rest of the region might fall into line. But as with many grand ideas written in ink on royal parchment, the reality was considerably muddier, in every sense of the word. Henry landed in France with about 12,000 men in August 1415, brimming with nationalistic confidence and armed with a legal claim to the French crown that he believed was not only just, but divinely ordained. He set up siege lines around Harfleur and began the medieval equivalent of waiting it out, building trenches, launching missiles, and blocking supplies into the city. So far, so textbook. But then the heat arrived, and the damp, and the flies. Henry's forces, camped in unsanitary ditches around the city walls, began to fall ill. Not from French arrows, but from contaminated water and poor hygiene. The army had packed plenty of weapons, but not nearly enough clean latrines. And by late September, the glorious siege had turned into something more closely resembling a plague ward. Dysentery tore through the camp. Soldiers weakened. Morale sank. Deaths mounted, not dramatically in battle, but miserably in the trenches. One chronicler noted that the English were beset not by the enemy's arrows, but by their own bellies. For a king hoping to strike fear into France, it was not the best first impression. And yet Henry refused to retreat. He pushed forward, refusing to break the siege even as his army visibly deteriorated. Part of this was strategic. To retreat was to lose face. But part of it was Henry's own stubbornness. He had cast himself as the chosen king, and chosen kings do not pack up and go home because of a few bad latrines. Harfleur eventually surrendered after a 5-week siege, largely due to starvation rather than English strength. Henry entered the town victorious, but with a badly depleted army. Thousands of men had died or been sent home sick. And still, rather than consolidating his win, Henry marched his weakened forces inland, directly toward Agincourt. The rest is legend. How Henry won an impossible battle. How the English longbow decimated French knights. How Shakespeare turned it into one of the most rousing speeches in literary history. But what gets forgotten is that Agincourt nearly didn't happen, and certainly wouldn't have happened the way it did, had Henry not stubbornly pressed through one of the most mismanaged siege campaigns of the 100 Years' War. What should have been a quick tactical victory became a drawn-out illness fest. He lost more men to disease at Harfleur than in the entire Battle of Agincourt. And yet, because history tends to forgive winners, Harfleur is treated like a necessary preamble, a prelude. But for the thousands of soldiers buried outside its walls, it was the main event. A vivid reminder that even the most celebrated kings can be brought low by mud, miscalculation, and an overestimation of their own immune systems. If Henry V's error was in ignoring the limits of his men, then his son, Edward I, would make his mistake in ignoring the limits of economics. Believing that Scotland could be subdued not with swords but with tax paperwork, he tried to invoice a nation into submission. It went about as well as you'd expect. 29. Edward I's attempt to conquer Scotland through taxes. Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks for his imposing height and Hammer of the Scots for his relentless campaigns, was not a man typically associated with bureaucratic subtlety. He was, after all, the king who built a string of stone castles across Wales, expelled England's Jewish population in 1290, and waged wars with a kind of moral certainty that suggested the Almighty himself had personally co-signed his military budget. And yet, amid his martial legacy lies one of the more baffling chapters in royal miscalculation: his attempt to conquer Scotland not by force, but by taxation. At first glance, it sounded simple. After the death of Scotland's king Alexander III and the infant Margaret, Maid of Norway, the Scottish crown was left vacant. Edward saw an opportunity. The Scottish nobles, caught in a succession crisis, invited Edward to arbitrate between claimants, most notably John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Ever the opportunist, Edward agreed. With strings. Lots of strings. In 1292, Edward declared John Balliol king, but insisted that Balliol acknowledge Edward as his feudal overlord. Balliol, outmaneuvered and not particularly forceful, agreed. For Edward, it was the ideal arrangement, a puppet king on the northern border who could rule Scotland in name while funneling loyalty, and more importantly, money, to England. So Edward began to issue demands. Scotland was expected to contribute funds, soldiers, and legal allegiance to England. Taxes were levied. Edward's clerks treated Scotland not as an ally, but as a vassal state, subject to the same financial extractions and bureaucratic oversight as any English shire. Legal appeals from Scottish courts were rerouted to Westminster. Trade privileges were adjusted to favor English merchants. And when Scottish nobles complained, Edward responded with polite indifference, then added more paperwork. It was, in theory, conquest by administration, a kind of fiscal colonization where the English crown would absorb Scottish sovereignty not with armies, but with audits. It didn't work. The Scots, historically proud and temperamentally allergic to foreign overlords, resisted, at first diplomatically, then politically, and finally, when it became clear that Edward had no intention of respecting their independence, militarily. In 1295, the Scots signed a treaty with France, the infamous Auld Alliance, and war broke out shortly after. Edward responded the only way he knew how, by invading. The result was a series of brutal, drawn-out conflicts that would last long after his death. Castles were seized, nobles executed, and cities sacked. William Wallace emerged as a national hero. Robert the Bruce took up the crown. And Scotland, instead of being bled dry through ledgers, bled out under the weight of actual battle. Ironically, Edward did have a reputation for legal reform and administrative efficiency in England. He oversaw significant changes to English common law, codified statutes, and expanded the royal courts. But in Scotland, the same tools backfired. His obsession with submission, particularly submission in writing, blinded him to the reality on the ground. You can't govern a nation into obedience by sending them tax bills they never asked for. By the time of his death in 1307, Edward had spent years campaigning in Scotland, achieving only temporary victories. His body was headed north when he died, still chasing the phantom of control he had once tried to write into existence. His son, Edward II, would inherit the war, and promptly lose much of the ground his father had taken. Scotland would eventually assert its independence for good, and Edward I's legacy as the Hammer of the Scots would become more myth than memory. In the end, his mistake wasn't aggression. It was overconfidence in paper dominance. He believed that by claiming feudal superiority and issuing decrees, he could turn Scotland into a northern province. What he got instead was centuries of rebellion, legendary freedom fighters, and the kind of national grudge that still gets referenced in modern sports commentary. But if Edward thought you could tax your way to conquest, Richard II showed just how far a monarch could go in the other direction, turning a time of national famine into a personal golden age by inventing gold-plated dining sets, even as his people starved in the fields. 30. Richard II, inventing gold dinnerware during famine. If you wanted a perfect snapshot of how utterly disconnected a king could become from the reality of his people, look no further than Richard II, dining off solid gold dishes while his subjects scoured barren fields for roots. It wasn't just indulgence, it was political theater, with a set built out of precious metals and an audience starving just off stage. Richard II came to the throne in 1377, at the tender age of 10, in the middle of an unstable period for England. The Black Death had recently decimated the population, the 100 Years' War continued to drain resources, and a new, more dangerous kind of political unrest was brewing. One that didn't come from nobles and castles, but from peasants with nothing left to lose. In 1381, the peasants' revolt erupted, a massive uprising driven by economic hardship, resentment of poll taxes, and the crushing realization that the ruling class had no intention of easing anyone's burden. Though the revolt was suppressed, it left a mark on the national psyche. The message was clear: ignore the people at your peril. Richard, unfortunately, did exactly that. Rather than tightening the royal belt, Richard went the opposite route. He doubled down on luxury, transforming court life into an unending procession of pageantry and extravagance. He commissioned countless paintings, redesigned royal palaces, and surrounded himself with art, music, and opulence. But the most jaw-dropping symbol of his self-absorption came in the form of his dining habits. According to chroniclers, Richard didn't just dine like a king, he dined like a god. At a time when famine swept through the countryside and bread was in short supply, he had dinner services crafted entirely from solid gold, not gold-plated, gold. Bowls, platters, cutlery, all gleaming with an ostentatiousness that left foreign dignitaries impressed and local peasants enraged. He didn't stop there. The meals themselves were theatrical events, imported spices, rare fruits, dishes so elaborate that their preparation required a brigade of specialized cooks and an army of servants. This wasn't nourishment, it was power. Consumed one jewel-studded bite at a time, and he made sure everyone saw it. Every feast was a performance of wealth and untouchability. At one banquet, it was said he insisted the dishes be changed after each course. Not because they were dirty, but because reusing plates, even gold ones, wasn't fitting for the crown. Meanwhile, just miles away, entire communities were scraping together meals from whatever they could grow, forage, or barter. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Richard's court became a bubble, walled in by luxury and flattery. He surrounded himself with loyalists who praised his taste and dismissed his critics. Parliament grew frustrated. Nobles questioned his priorities. And the people, the ones still paying taxes and watching their children go hungry, began to turn against him. By the late 1390s, Richard's popularity had cratered. His attempts to consolidate power by punishing political enemies only deepened the resentment. He exiled key nobles, revoked charters, and ruled by personal decree. The golden tableware remained, but the gold beneath his throne had begun to rot. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile and seized power with remarkable ease. Richard, isolated and abandoned, was deposed without much resistance. He was imprisoned and quietly removed from the political equation. Some say he starved. Others say he wasted away. Either way, he left behind no heir, no legacy, and no one to mourn the downfall of a king who mistook spectacle for statecraft. His gold dishes likely ended up melted down, repurposed by the very regime that replaced him. As for the people who had once watched his lavish meals from a distance, they got a new king and the same old taxes. Richard II's reign is a masterclass in how not to read the room. He believed that a monarch's power came from image, from shining brighter than the common man could ever imagine. But the truth was far duller and more dangerous. In times of hunger, no amount of gilded cutlery can mask a kingdom's despair. And speaking of throwing away royal resources like confetti, Henry VIII, never one to miss a chance at overdoing anything, built enormous palaces for each of his wives, only to abandon them faster than his vows. Because why have one functioning royal residence when you can have 6 half-used ones and a fleet of ex-wives to avoid? 31. Henry VIII. Building vast palaces, then abandoning them. There are kings who build empires, and then there's Henry VIII, a king who built palaces like a teenager buys concert merch, impulsively, expensively, and with no real plan for what to do once the thrill wore off. Henry wasn't just a monarch. He was a force of appetite. He wanted everything bigger, grander, louder, and more gilded than anything that came before. And when it came to architecture, that meant palaces. Not just one, not just a couple. Henry ordered the construction and renovation of dozens of royal residences, each designed to be more impressive than the last, each tailored to the whims of the moment, or more accurately, to the whims of whichever wife happened to be in favor that season. This was not a man who inherited his castles and made minor improvements. Henry was a compulsive builder. Nonsuch Palace, for instance, one of his most ambitious projects, was named so because, in Henry's words, there was none such like it in the world. Built to celebrate the birth of his long-awaited male heir, Edward, Nonsuch was a fusion of Renaissance style, Tudor arrogance, and astronomical cost. It featured stucco reliefs, elaborate gardens, imported marble, and, despite being one of the most impressive architectural feats of the age, Henry never spent more than a few days there. It wasn't just about grandeur, it was about control. Every palace became a stage, every courtyard a theater. When Henry was courting Anne Boleyn, he remodeled Hampton Court, turning it into a palace fit for a queen, only to execute her 3 years later. After that, the palace was subtly rebranded for Jane Seymour, who gave birth to his only male heir and then died from complications. A few rooms were changed, a few tapestries replaced. The buildings changed, but the strategy remained the same. Lavish your wife with a kingdom, until it's time to move on. Each palace became a monument to a failed relationship, an architectural love letter that usually ended in fire, disuse, or quiet abandonment. Whitehall Palace, once the largest palace in Europe, became the royal nerve center during the height of his power. But even that was not enough. Henry began constructing additional wings, halls, and lodges. More space, more spectacle, and then, inevitably, another shift. A falling out, a death, a divorce. He didn't just build for love. He built to compete. With foreign kings, with the legacy of his father, and perhaps most of all, with his own increasingly bloated image of greatness. As Henry's waistline expanded, so did his floor plans. What's truly remarkable is how many of these properties, despite their size and splendor, were barely used. Some palaces were occupied for mere weeks before being cast aside. Others were finished posthumously or never completed at all. The maintenance costs were astronomical, draining the royal treasury faster than wars or feasts ever could. Henry had dissolved the monasteries partly to refill his coffers, and much of that money ended up bricked into empty banquet halls. The irony? Many of these buildings don't even exist today. Nonsuch Palace was torn down less than 150 years after it was built. Its stones sold off, its ornaments repurposed. Whitehall burned. Only Hampton Court remains in relatively complete form, a shell of royal ambition housing ghosts of queens' plots and overcooked dinners. Henry's endless cycle of build and abandon wasn't just poor planning. It was policy by personality. A government of bricks and lust. When he adored, he constructed. When he soured, he walked away, leaving behind the scaffolding, the bills, and the servants with no monarch to serve. His palaces became his diary, sprawling, inconsistent, occasionally brilliant, mostly tragic. Each residence a footnote in a personal saga of insecurity and excess. Not one of them, not a single royal home, gave him the peace he sought. Because what Henry really wanted wasn't another castle. It was legacy. And you can't lay that in stone. But if Henry buried gold in marble and mortar, Charles there would make an even stranger misstep, commissioning masterpieces by Anthony van Dyck while his kingdom crumbled around him. Because when your people are planning rebellion, what better distraction than commissioning a flattering oil portrait to hang over the fireplace in your soon-to-be abandoned palace? 32. Charles I, collecting Van Dyck portraits. While the country rebelled. There's being out of touch with your people, and then there's Charles I commissioning court portraits while the country slipped into civil war. A monarch who, with the calm of a man blissfully unaware of his own decline, continued to pose for Anthony van Dyck as though nothing outside the gilded frame could touch him. Charles didn't merely love art, he wrapped himself in it. He believed in the divine right of kings, and he wanted to be seen as a king in the most literal, painterly sense, which is why, even as Parliament seethed, the treasury emptied, and political tensions creaked under their own weight, Charles continued investing time, money, and royal image into an ever-growing collection of portraits, altarpieces, and stately oils, most notably from Van Dyck, his Flemish court painter and image consultant extraordinaire. To Charles, Van Dyck was not just an artist. He was a tool of legitimacy, a man who could immortalize authority, majesty, and grace with a few well-placed brushstrokes. The portraits he commissioned weren't casual, they were choreographed. In one, Charles stands tall, relaxed, regal, his hand resting on a table as if he had just finished signing peace with Europe. In another, he's on horseback, draped in armor, surveying his realm with quiet strength. Never mind that parts of that realm were already openly plotting against him. This wasn't just vanity, it was politics by canvas. Charles believed that by carefully controlling how he appeared, he could reinforce his divinely ordained right to rule. That if his subjects could see him as noble, untroubled, and anointed by heaven, then rebellion would seem absurd, treasonous even. But as it turned out, paint doesn't hold kingdoms together. By the late 1630s, the kingdom was spiraling. Charles's decision to rule without parliament for over a decade, his so-called personal rule, had isolated him from the political class. His imposition of controversial taxes, like the notorious ship money, and his aggressive promotion of high Anglicanism alienated both commoners and Puritans. Then came the final straw. His attempt to force a new prayer book on Scotland, sparking the bishops' wars and draining royal funds even further. Did Charles stop to reflect? Did he call a council, shift strategy, or attempt reconciliation? No. He commissioned more portraits. Van Dyck, ever the professional, obliged. Even as England edged toward collapse, Charles's court became a gallery of denial, images of stability and elegance housed within a palace of mounting chaos. The irony was thick enough to varnish. To Charles, art was permanence. Politics, in contrast, was messy, shifting, and mortal. He seemed to believe that as long as he remained beautiful on canvas, history would stay on his side. It didn't. In 1642, the English Civil War erupted. Parliamentarians took up arms against the king. Battles raged. Castles fell. And through it all, Charles clung to the image of himself as a king wronged, a martyr in the making. Even as his armies shrank and his allies deserted him, he never stopped projecting the idea that he was still the rightful sovereign, the same one in all those Van Dyck masterpieces. Eventually, Charles was captured, tried, and, in a moment that stunned all of Europe, executed. A king, brought low not by foreign invasion, but by his own people. The monarch who believed in the power of divine imagery lost his head in front of a crowd who had stopped believing in images. And yet his portraits remained. They still hang today, serene and confident, immune to dust and history's harsher edits. In them, Charles is always composed, always royal, forever untouched by rebellion. Because that was his final miscalculation, believing that being seen as a king was the same as being one. But if Charles tried to polish his crown with paint, James I had a far more tactile approach to affection. A monarch so openly enamored with his favorites that he kissed them on the lips in front of his entire court, leaving ambassadors speechless and courtiers scrambling for excuses not to look directly at the throne. 33. James I's slobbery. Public affection for courtiers. When it came to royal affection, James I did not believe in subtlety. While most monarchs kept their personal feelings behind heavy velvet curtains, James seemed to believe the throne was best shared, and sometimes smooched, right in the middle of court. This wasn't metaphorical affection. James was physically demonstrative, and not in the casual hand-on-the-shoulder way. He kissed his male favorites full on the mouth in public, in front of nobles, foreign dignitaries, and anyone else unfortunate enough to be within lip-smacking distance. It was so common that ambassadors wrote home about it with barely restrained disbelief, trying to translate royal snogging into diplomatic language. The most infamous recipient of these royal affections was George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, a man so stunning and charming that James elevated him from minor gentry to the highest ranks of nobility in just a few short years. The king referred to him publicly as "my sweet child and wife," lavished him with titles and estates, and gave him political responsibilities well beyond his experience, all while openly embracing him in court like a long-lost lover in a stage play. James's behavior baffled his contemporaries. England, newly Protestant and still nursing a Puritan streak, wasn't especially fond of flamboyant courtly displays, especially ones that blurred the lines between affection and favoritism. Courtiers murmured, nobles squirmed. Foreign envoys reported with barely concealed amusement. One French ambassador famously described the king as forever caressing his favorites, using a tone better suited for describing overeager golden retrievers. But for James, none of this seemed to matter. He saw no conflict between his role as a God-ordained monarch and his habit of wrapping his arms around younger men in silk stockings. He considered such affection a virtue, a sign of loyalty, trust, and intimacy in a cold political world. His affection, he insisted, was as chaste as it was passionate. History remains politely skeptical. While these displays weren't the only reason Parliament grew wary of James's rule, they certainly didn't help. They symbolized a court where power was distributed through personal closeness, not competence. a monarchy that rewarded those who stayed near the royal lips, not those who served the kingdom's needs. And so, in the final tally of absurd royal behaviors, James earns his place not for conquest or cruelty, but for the most awkward hugs in European political history, an emperor of awkward intimacy, puckering proudly while his empire winced.